Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the BeckDeck podcast. This is Kenton, Hornbeck, co-host of the BeckDeck podcast, joined alongside Logan Decker. Logan, how are we doing, man?
Doing great, man. It was a good weekend, good football. Went to the driving range again. Should not have done that. I'm even more sore than last weekend, but can't complain. It's finally getting cold here in the Carolinas, so I'm not particularly enjoying the winter reminder. But 28 degrees down here, while in the Cincinnati area, we're probably talking single digits depending on the time of the day. So I really can't complain too much. How about yourself, man?
Funny enough, I'm up here in Toronto, Canada, Toronto, Ontario, and it is very cold here as well. It's probably sub 30 degrees. I went out and saw Lake Ontario yesterday, walking around where Paro, my girlfriend, was in the Pokemon competition, and the wind is sharp. It feels like little knives stabbing you in the face, just going through all the buildings and coming off the lake. So it's really pretty cold up here as well.
Yeah, man. It's I've never been out of the U.S. before. Haven't even been in Canada. It's on the list. How did the Pokemon competition go?
She actually did really well. She went 5-3. It was close at the end. She had an opportunity to finish 6-2, but just couldn't get it done in that last round. But ultimately, it went pretty well. The competition, we were unsure if there was going to be a bunch of people show up. Typically, there's anywhere between, I would say, 700 to a little north of 1,000 people. I'm not sure the number for this regional, but because the weather got so bad when we were driving in from Detroit, I mean, the snow was pouring outside. We were literally driving through a snowstorm. People's flights coming from CVG got canceled, so they had to drive up, and it was a mess. It was sloshy up here. We also have a Prius that she was driving. That was a little concerning, but we ended up making it. And dude, the weather up here is crazy. I mean, snow doesn't faze anyone. Doesn't mean they drive well, though, I will say. People still drive like they're nuts up here, but the snow didn't seem to faze anyone.
Yeah, it's a big difference up there. You know, down here, if we got a inch of snow, they freak out, asking about, oh, are we getting off work? Or people will raid your Walmart and all that, bread, milk, eggs. I'm sitting there, I'm like, it's an inch, guys. They'll freak out about it. It's not even cold enough to stick. So it's definitely a different environment and different feel for it. But I do agree, the further north you are, the less you're affected, and they're more prepared for it, obviously.
And it does stick up here. I will tell everyone that. It sticks. It is really snowy. There's probably quite a few inches of snow on the ground outside, which is cool. It's nice to see Toronto in its natural environment, and I'm not saying that as a slight. I mean, I'd almost prefer it be snowy if you're going to come in January just to see the scenery and what it looks like. Also, I want to note, I walked over to Scotiabank Arena where the Toronto Maple Leafs and Raptors play, and then right up the street is the Rogers Center or Sky Dome where the Blue Jays played, and then literally right next to it, like you could toss a rock from the steps of the baseball stadium and hit the CN Tower, and you look up and you see Drake sitting on the edge. You see his little feet dangling off. But no, what's cool is it goes so high up that the clouds, the top of the tower kind of like is shrouded in clouds, which is really pretty neat.
That is pretty cool. Yeah, it's on the list to go visit. Don't know when it's going to happen, but it's on the list. That being said, I think we'll introduce our first topic for the day. And obviously we had a couple games go on last night, but we wanted to talk about, at least in our memories, I can think that this is the most amount of NFL coaching jobs that have been available in a singular cycle. I believe we have, let me see, do my quick math in my head, counting skills, 9 openings. One of them is already filled. Actually, 2. Second one of the 9 filled up last night, but I figured we would go right down the list and see, hey, how do we think some of these new hires that have already been made, and who we potentially could see filling the jobs of some other places. Some of these teams include the Giants, the Falcons, who both of these teams have already filled their job as of last night. Then we have openings with the Ravens, the Steelers, the Browns, Raiders, my Titans, the Dolphins, and the Cardinals. So I guess I wanted to lead off with the jobs that have been filled. What are your thoughts about the Giants and the Falcons hires?
I want to start with Atlanta. I really like the Falcons hire. Kevin Stefanski, for anybody who doesn't know, is a 2-time NFL Coach of the Year. So, in my opinion, John Harbaugh, he's gotten a lot of the hype because he's a former Super Bowl champion. People were talking about him the most because he arguably left the best job that's available right now, which being the Baltimore Ravens. You have access to Lamar Jackson, a really good owner. But Kevin Stefanski is a good coach in his own right, and I think he went a little unheralded in this coaching search, primarily because Cleveland has not been competitive in a few years. So even though he's a good coach, and I don't put a lot of stock into their performance strictly at the feet of Kevin Stefanski, I do think that his situation in Cleveland just made him underrated. People kind of forgot, like, hey, how good of a coach is this guy? And what I really like for Atlanta is they've struggled on offense the past couple of years. They have a lot of offensive weapons, but not a lot of great offensive production leading to wins. Kyle Pitts, but who knows if he'll be there. They drafted a new quarterback, Michael Penix. They have Kirk Cousins, who can still toss it around a little bit. They have Drake London and Bijan Robinson, obviously. When you look up and down their offensive roster, there's weapons everywhere, but they have not been able to get the most out of the weapons. I think Kevin Stefanski, coming in fresh, new, reinvigorated, is going to be able to get more out of the Falcons' weapons, which is going to be, I think, really helpful in a division where there's no clear best team. This year, Tampa Bay started out really hot, and then they came back down to earth. Baker Mayfield regressed a little bit going toward the end of the season. The Saints showed some promise. Kellen Moore's a good coach. He had Tyler Shuck and him were kind of clicking there toward the end of the year. And then you had the Carolina Panthers, who ended up winning the division by default. The whole year seemed to be a war of attrition, and I believe that Atlanta has enough weapons around whoever their quarterback is going to be with Kevin Stefanski to push for a division championship, even though they weren't, in the mix this year. I believe they finished 7-10 or 6-11. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but they were a few games below 500. They still were competitive throughout the duration of the season. So that's the one that really sticks out to me. I'll let you take John Harbaugh. That one's a little less obvious to me on how it's going to work out, because Harbaugh is a good coach, but I don't know. I could see this going sideways, maybe not because of him, but I think the Giants are pretty inept. It could work out, it could not. I'm a little up in the air on this one.
Yeah, it's the Giants, and it doesn't surprise me with their ownership that they wanted to hire a guy that was obviously well-known, well-established, well-respected. And I still like John Harbaugh as a coach, with the Ravens, record of 180 wins, 113 losses, 13-11 playoff record, and obviously has the one Super Bowl. I think with their recent coaches, if you remember, of course, Brian Daboll, who was fired, he won 22-45, 1-1 record in the playoff. And let's just say after Tom Coughlin was fired, they've had this, 3 to 4 years of different coaches that they've just had in and out, and a lot of them, it was their first time head coaching opportunities. So it doesn't surprise me that their ownership was like, okay, let's flip the script a little bit. Let's get a well-known name. How often are you going to have a cycle like this where you have, and we'll talk about this one later, but you have 2 Super Bowl winning coaches that are technically on the market. So they wanted to get a guy that's well established. They get John Harbaugh. What I'm curious in is what coordinators he brings with him. Because just his background, before he became a head coach, Harbaugh was a special teams guy. And he's always been linked. You've seen bigger changes in how the offense run things based on the coordinator that he has. He's not one of those coaches like a Mike McDaniel who's taking complete control of the offense or anything like that. But he's well connected. He has a lot of coaches within his tree. I don't think he'll have any issue bringing, let's just say, different guys in for a new plan, potentially a new regime. And this Giants roster has a lot of talent, obviously, between some of the younger guys they've had, drafted. So they had a really good draft class last year. They have some really good pieces on defense. My question, and this really isn't a coaching hire, and this is their GM, Joe Sheen. I've heard a lot of NFL talking heads basically say, like, if you're going, and I agree to some point, is that if you're going to fire your coach, you should probably fire the GM as well, kind of a clean slate. So you have a GM who probably has the hottest seat in the GM position in the entire NFL, and it's to the point where he's potentially making some desperation moves at this point. And then you bring in a coach like Harbaugh. Does this cool the seat for Joe? Does this make him a little bit more aggressive because he knows that if they have another bad season, he's obviously going to be the next one out because John is getting started and they're going to give him the time to build this up because of the amount of success he's had in the past? We'll have to see. And not to switch off on the Giants, but to think about, why did John Harbaugh, this legendary coach, probably future NFL Hall of Fame, he'll be placed with that depending on the rest of his career, and I think he's basically got it locked up at this point. But why did he get let go from the Ravens? And I think a lot of it is, and we may have mentioned it a few times already, is just how many times does a team like that get to the point where it looks like, you have multiple losses in the past few years that you can note that they've lost double-digit leads, that offensive momentum gets killed. You can talk about time management within the game, when to use timeouts, when not. And I think potentially for a coach like this will allow for some perspective to, it's like, okay, some things didn't work in Baltimore, in the old town. What do I have to do different? So we've seen plenty of coaches get fired, and usually you see them take a break when they've been working this long, like Mike McCarthy's a name that pops up in my head, or the head coach for the Commanders right now that I'm having a terrible time remembering the name, but I can. Dan Quinn. You've had coaches that have had this success that have taken a year out. Mike Vrabel is another one of those. But he jumps right back in. And that doesn't surprise me because the Harbaughs are hidden psychopaths, which is a good thing in this context. But I'm very curious to see who he brings in. And I think a lot of it is just because they're the Ravens coaching tree, and specifically under a Harbaugh, is so open. There are so many people that came out of the tree that potentially we may not see them hire their coordinators for another week or potentially after the Super Bowl, because some of these teams that are still playing have some guys from his tree still connected. And then just to flip the script, just to add a little bit of time for the Falcons there, it doesn't surprise me at all that Raheem Morris got fired. The Falcons, and I feel like this is the story of, let's just say even go back to Matt Ryan's days, that this is a team that for the most part has had really good talent, but has for the most part overwhelmingly underperformed. So many good pieces on offense, Bijan Robinson, Drake London. They've always had an interchangeable number twos, but Darnell Mooney's been really solid. And when he's healthy, you got Kyle Pitts. Who knows what he does, but he's going to get paid on the market. They finally, they traded up to get a second draft pick in the first round last year. They get some phenomenal rushers on the defensive side, which is greatly needed. And they've always had a solid offensive line for the past decade. So them bringing in Stefanski, I think, is a wonderful hire. That was the number one coach that I wanted Tennessee to hire. So I'm very jealous of the Falcons since last night. But I think this is a guy that he was the one that kind of brought Baker. Obviously he was the head coach when Baker got drafted to Cleveland, and Baker had his legendary run with the playoffs, getting the Browns their first playoff win in decades. And I think this is really good for Bijan Robinson, the run game. I think he's always been get the run game going first to open up stuff for the quarterback. And at least for next year, it's going to be Kirk Cousins out of the gate because, it's going to take some time for Michael Penix to come back from his injury, his long list of injuries. And we all kind of laughed and clowned this past year about, can't get rid of Kirk Cousins. You're paying him that much for a backup. And then all of a sudden, you're like, I understand it now. Michael Penix, this was the insurance. And that's what it always was, and we knew it. But it's different when it's in the thought process versus it's actually happening. And who knows when Penix is coming back. So I think this will be really good for them being competitive next year with Kirk Cousins and the weapons that they do have. So hats off to them. And I'll go ahead and I'll kind of serve you up here. So I mentioned another Super Bowl winning coach being out. Now he's technically stepping down. He wasn't fired. The Steelers still have rights to him, and it's obviously Mike Tomlin. I think this is the hardest one to try to guess who they're going to hire because the Steelers are a unique organization. So I'll hand it off to you and give your thoughts on the Steelers and how this process has gone so far.
For me, the Steelers' job is an enigma. I'm not really sure what to make of it or what coach would sign themselves up for this situation because for me, it has less to do with the head coach and it's more about the overall situation their franchise is in, what players they are paying in the current day. Guys like TJ Watt and Hayward on the defensive line. Obviously, they signed Aaron Rodgers at quarterback. I don't believe now with Tomlin gone, he's going to be back at Pittsburgh. There are veteran players on the roster who I think expect to compete. So to me, that mentality lends itself to hiring a coach who's willing to come in, maybe an older coach, and immediately keep the roster going the way it has been for the past couple of years. Earlier in the pod, not this pod, but previous pods, we had discussed Mike Tomlin's situation in Pittsburgh. I think we both believe he's a good coach and is a Hall of Fame coach. He's never had a losing season, famously, or even infamously at this point, because it's become a little bit of a meme. Not having a losing season, but going 10-7 or 9-8, which are good records, aren't what Pittsburgh Steelers fans expect from their team. So over the past couple of years, Mike Tomlin, this year division champion, went 10-7. 2024, 10-7. 2023, 10-7. 2022, 9-8. And 2021, 9-7. He had 12 wins in 2020, the COVID year. Right around 500 every single year, even with players like TJ Watt, this great defense. They've struggled at quarterback because they haven't really found anybody post Ben Roethlisberger. They missed on Kenny Pickett, who was the hometown guy, played at Pitt for all of those years. Didn't seemingly work out. They moved off him, and they've been band-aiding it, kind of like the Colts ever since. Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers, still better results, still getting to the playoffs or being right on the periphery of it, but not really elevating the team. And I fear for Steelers fans that the ownership is looking to keep this core intact, and they're looking to continue on this trajectory of mediocrity Tomlin stepping down won't change the Steelers situation unless something fundamental about their team makeup changes. So to me, you mentioned Mike McCarthy a little earlier. I'm not saying he's going to take this job, but this job feels like it's suitable for someone kind of in that vein, a veteran head coach who's available to come in and continue the Steelers' push toward first-round playoff exits, being 10-7, keeping the guys competitive, keeping them up, but not making any fundamental changes that will ultimately help the Steelers in the end, because there was no second Mike Tomlin era. Actually, there was. I take that back. His first era was in the late 2000s or the late aughts when he was going 10-plus wins every year and they won a Super Bowl. And they were also runners-up in the Super Bowl against Green Bay, I think in 2010 or 2011. That was the first Tomlin era. They had 2 years of going 8-8, and then he rebounds in like 2014 through 2017, and they're going, 12 wins every year, right about. They had that one really good year, the Killer Bees year, where they went 13-3. And then after that, they had that one lone 12-4 season in 20 and have been completely mediocre. So there was no third wave of Tomlin. He's had first era, second era, and the third era, they weren't quite good enough to keep him around. And I think him stepping down says something because, like we were saying earlier, he's not a bad coach by any means. He's one of the best coaches of the 21st century, but he wasn't able to get more out of the roster because maybe either he got complacent, and I don't mean he purposefully got complacent. I just don't felt like he thought there was any wiggle room. Every year, the Steelers' offseason was the same thing. Hey, let's find a new quarterback. Hey, what veterans are we going to sign to smaller contracts to kind of tinker around the edges? And I know we predicted the same thing, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast. I thought they would be making a change this offseason. So they are making a change. They're moving off their longtime head coach, Mike Tomlin. The question mark is, do they go out and hire a younger coach or a coach that's willing to remake this roster or help remake the roster, draft some new players, and transform the Pittsburgh Steelers, moving them into a new era? Or are they going to Band-Aid this because they think their roster and their defense is good enough to, hey, if we're 10-7 this year, maybe next year we go 12 wins and we're toward the top of the conference. All we got to do is win a couple more games and we're up toward the top of our weakened division. Things are shifting around us. We don't know what Baltimore's going to be like. Cleveland is an open question mark. And Cincinnati has underperformed for the past couple of years. Ultimately, to round out my point, I just think that Pittsburgh needs a younger, more innovative head coach to move them into a new era, get off this old, stale, defensive grind football they've been on for quite some time. And the Steelers, if they sacrifice like a season or two coming up and rebuild, I think they're going to be in a healthier position going forward. But that's not what this franchise does. So I'm interested to get your thoughts on it. To me, it's a very polarizing situation to be in.
Yeah, it's when you have so many years of Mike Tomlin and the Steelers' record, and every single Steelers fan will admit this, is that you are good enough, obviously, to be in the playoffs, but not good enough to make a deep run with these rosters and these teams they've had. And the problem with that is you never get the higher draft picks to have a higher chance of getting a guy to really flesh out the roster or be a pillar. And I'm not saying that's every year because the Steelers are really good at drafting, and I will give them credit for that. It's just that they don't have the opportunity to get some of those for sure guys or definitely some game changers. The Steelers aren't really known to be a organization that's going to sell their future to try to move up either, to try to make this guy happen. You know, maybe a couple spots, but they're not going to make the leap into the top 10, top 5 usually. I think I 100% agree, depending on their next hire is really going to dictate what is coming up next for the regime, because this is not a regime that wants to kind of lay down, and they have been doing the Band-Aid approach where it's like we consistently think, oh, we got the roster. They continue to pay these defensive players to try the most expensive defensive unit. We have mentioned that in the NFL this year, and they have not performed up to it just because they have had a lot of aging veterans who are, quite frankly, past their prime on that unit. And then I could make the argument, even though it wasn't phenomenal play, but Aaron Rodgers is the best quarterback individual season, in my opinion, that they've had since Ben Roethlisberger stepped away from the game. Now, in terms of what I was able to look up, is each one of these teams that still have openings, who they've done interviews with so far, and they can kind of give us a mindset. So the people that they've interviewed so far is the defensive coordinator for the Rams, Chris Shula, son, I believe grandson of Don Shula. You got Jeff Hafley, defensive coordinator for the Packers, Jesse Minter, defensive coordinator for the Chargers, Marcus Freeman, who has been a very hot name, and part of that is because Marcus Freeman's hometown is Pittsburgh. I believe he also went to college at Pittsburgh too. And then Brian Flores. So out of this list, you have a lot of young guys who have never had a head coaching opportunity. So I think that's a sign that the Steelers are trying to recognize, like, okay, this is truly in the end of the Mike Tomlin eras. We're going to be, I would think that this is for them, is like, we got to restructure this roster. We got to build for the future right now. I'm not saying you just signed TJ Watt to this extension. They paid some of their anchor guys. That's fine. So I think if you sign any one of basically the first four names that I mentioned there, that's a signal for that. If they were to sign Brian Flores, I'm like, okay, they're just going to keep hitting their head on the wall. And I like Brian Flores. That's one guy I wouldn't mind the Titans bringing in, because I think he's a phenomenal defensive mind. But I think you can obviously tell here what's the mindset of the Steelers and what has it always been? Defense, defense, defense. 4 out of the 5 guys on this list are defensive coordinators.
They have a type.
They do have a type, but that's one of those things because we grew up in the area of the AFC North. There's a little bit different football, and those defenses will make or break that division more often than not. So I understand the mindset of it. It's just we'll have to wait and see. For me, I'm sure Steelers fans are probably to the point where disappointed with how everything ended, but they know it's the end of an era and give all the respects to Mike Tomlin, despite the past couple seasons kind of having this uprising and feeling that something's got to change and that he's got to go. But I think they also know that whatever change comes, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better. But you have to have it happen. That's the NFL. You cannot, as a Titans fan, I can 100% confirm it is not fun being 8-8, 8-9, 7-10, because you just stick there, and eventually the bottom falls out. And I think this is the point where, hey, let the bottom fall out, reset it, get your finances right with a salary cap. It's going to take a few years, but when you're in a division that has Joe Burrow, that has Lamar Jackson in their prime, guess what? It's going to take a few years. Like, hate to make the comparison, but that's like where the Raiders are at. Not on the talent level or not on the record, but hey, they are at the point where they bottom out with the Derek Carr era, and they are still on this climb up. Hopefully for the Steelers, it doesn't take as long, but with the Raiders, when you're in a division like, you have Patrick Mahomes, you have Bo Nix, who we'll talk about in a little bit further along with that news. And then you have your Chargers quarterback. It's tough. It's tough. You got to build up into it. That being said, I already threw a team name out there, so I figured we might as well jump on it, unless you want to stick with the Steelers, is the Raiders firing Pete Carroll, who historically great coach for Seattle, well known in college at the University of Southern Cal, but not the best experience with the Las Vegas Raiders, who finished 3-14 on the year, and after the first season, he's out. What's your thoughts about the Raiders' next move?
I thought it was unusual they hired Pete Carroll last offseason. I was pretty confused, honestly. I thought Pete Carroll was thoroughly retired, and any sort of coaching that Pete Carroll would have done would have been in like a consultant type role, come in and have him oversee, not like be directly over, but kind of help and mentor a younger coach as part of the front office. I thought that was, or not front office, the coaching staff. I thought that was the role that Pete Carroll would have played. Instead, he gets a full-time head coaching job with who else but the Las Vegas Raiders, who just cannot seem to do anything correctly. Pete Carroll finished the year 3-14, and that was a little shocking for me because I thought, not because of Pete Carroll necessarily, I thought the Raiders could have been a little better this year. I felt like coming into the season, even though, yes, their receivers were bad, and yes, Pete Carroll was old and potentially washed up, and yes, Geno Smith, is he going to be the same kind of player? I still thought there was enough talent in the building to give the team an identity of some sort and use that as a springboard to get, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 wins, be a wild card team, 10 wins at the best. Instead, they had Chip Kelly at offensive coordinator. I watched a few videos on YouTube about how poorly coached the Raiders were this year. Guys being out of spots, guys not communicating with Geno Smith, him getting frustrated. There were videos I watched, and I can't remember the creator, so I'm sorry if anybody made these videos. I just can't think of it off the top of my head, but there were videos where Geno would be signaling to the receiver to run a certain route or a route out of what he was initially in. The guy just completely ignores it, and they miscommunication, gets intercepted. Geno goes nuclear on the sideline. Not to take all the pressure off Geno Smith, though, because he didn't play very well this year either. And Chip Kelly cannot sniff another NFL locker room. That guy needs to stay in college, where he's always belonged. Great success at Ohio State. Great success at Oregon. Guess what? What success in the NFL? I don't see any. And they knew that because they moved off of him in the middle of the year. And Pete Carroll oversaw that regime, and now he's gone. And it feels like this has went a little under the radar this year because Bill Belichick is coaching for the University of North Carolina, and him and Michael Lombardi have embarrassed that program with their comments and their personal antics and their coaching. But North Carolina didn't finish as bad as the Raiders did this year. And it's been underrated to have all these people talk about Bill Belichick and how poorly he's doing, and then Pete Carroll, another legendary coach, albeit not on the same level as Bill Belichick, can go 3-14 and nobody seems to care. Why? Because it's the Raiders and they always do something like this. So looking forward, I do think there are some pillars on the team. You have, you know what? No, because those guys are unhappy. Like Max Crosby, he wants out. Geno Smith is old and was a Band-Aid. They do have Ashton Genty, who I do think is a good player. Obviously, you don't want to completely build around a running back, but their offensive line isn't that great, and they have no receivers. I mean, Jack Beck is one of your best receivers. No offense to him, but that is not good. There are some serious holes on this team, and the infrastructure of, the older players who are established and good seemingly want out or don't want to play for them anymore. And that's not a good position to be in. So we're looking at another full-scale rebuild. I mean, 3-14, it's only up from here, I guess, for Las Vegas. To me, I don't really know what they're kind of thinking. I mean, anybody would be better than what they had, but they have to get a younger, hotshot head coach, maybe somebody who is... I mean, you could probably speak to this because you've looked at who they've interviewed. I think it's probably one of the more interesting jobs, but it's a familiar place for the Raiders because they're used to rebuilding. And the last thing I'll say about Vegas is, Mark Davis and his father, Al Davis, Al especially, they're very legendary figures. Mark is a little more of a meme, but they're both very recognizable in the football world. Everybody knows who they are. And yet, really limited to zero success over the 21st century. I know they made the Super Bowl in 2002. The Mark Davis regime has been worse than his elder dad, who was really losing it there at the end, just drafting scrubs left and right. And Mark is also drafting scrubs left and right. And they feel like sometimes they do hit on some interesting players, but the past couple off seasons have just been an embarrassment. They've had this Pete Carroll debacle, then they hired Antonio Pierce. I believe the year prior to that, when Pierce became, was it Antonio Pierce or the Rich? I can't remember his last name. One of those two guys kind of overcame an early season collapse, and they won out at the end of the year, and they were pretty good. I don't really know where they go. I mean, I guess just anything is better than what they've been doing. But hiring an 70-something-year-old coach was pretty perplexing, and it didn't seem like they had a real plan going into last offseason. And I'm not super confident they're going to hire someone with a plan, or if the organization even has one this offseason.
Yeah, the Raiders are in a tough spot. I could make the argument that they could potentially be in a worse situation than the Cleveland Browns. It's not an appealing job. I felt like going into this year, I agree with everything that you said. Hiring a 77-year-old as a head coach is an interesting move. I understand why they were doing it. They're trying to all right, this is a good foundation. We're going to, well-respected locker room guy. But then you bring in a bunch of the Chip Kelly hire. I kind of scratched my head to begin with, and I was like, what kind of connection does he have to Pete Carroll? And obviously that didn't work, and I'm not going to dive a whole lot of in-depth because you covered it pretty well. That dude just stick to college. That's what he's good at. In terms of who they're interviewing, I've already mentioned a lot of these names. There's Jeff Hafley, Jesse Minter, Kevin Stefanski, who is no longer available, and Robert Saleh. That's what they've had so far. So once again, defensive mindset of guys. I like all three of those options, three candidates that are available. I hope that the Raiders organization, specifically the Davis, needs to. This is going to be timely. This is going to take some time to really rebuild because you rushed it, you brought it back, you tried to force the hand, and it blew up in your face. This is the year that you were trying. You were like, all right, let's make a run for the division. Bringing in Geno, giving him this big contract, drafting Aston Genty, and it's almost like, you got a teenager. Imagine your 13-year-old self, and you're trying to repair the Raiders franchise with Madden, and you're doing all these trades, and you're setting all this up, and you're just like, wow, I got all these awesome skill players, and you completely forget about your offensive line, which is atrocious. Geno Smith has always been a guy that you gotta, and I've talked about this before, he needs the protection built around him. He's one of those guys that is, some people may hate me saying this, but put him in the Jared Goff category where he needs the structure built around him, not him, being a Josh Allen and playing beyond what the structure is allowing him in the offense. So, they're coming in with the number one pick. I would like to think they're going to draft Mendoza, but man, I feel so bad for Mendoza. And I've heard a lot of people that say Kurt Signetti's name, that like, hey, you want to be the coach and coach your guy, first round pick, stick the band together. I have no reason why he would want to leave Indiana. It's the stupidest thing I've heard. It's like, hey, do you want to get paid less to come and coach for the Raiders just so you can play with your boy, your quarterback, Mendoza, and try to rebuild this atrocious team? I wouldn't. I'd be like, hey, Mendoza's cool, but I got another 4-star coming in this year. We're going to ball out again, and I'm going to be paid for it. And I'm probably going to be sitting with my national championship trophy here too, to be honest. And that's not me hating on Miami. But who do they hire out of that? I don't know. We'll see. I do think Robert Saleh deserves another shot, although his tenure with the Jets was not fantastic. I think you could take any NFL coach and put him on the Jets, and it probably won't be fantastic. It's just that type of organization. So yeah, that's one of those. I think that's the least exciting job in terms of all the openings. At least the Browns have. It's like, oh, we have good defensive players, set up. We have a good duo of running backs that we just drafted. They have some excitement to them. They have some players. And the Raiders, all their key players have already been traded or they want out. So we'll see. I already mentioned the Browns. Might as well stick with them. Of course, Kevin Stefanski gets fired. We all knew it was coming. But I can also say, we can all agree that it wasn't his fault. He always had his defenses set up. They always performed well despite how bad the offenses were. This goes back, and I know this is an easy potential cop-out, but it was never him that destroyed the Browns, that made this massive mistake to pay a record-breaking guaranteed money contract to Watson to play as their quarterback, who has been, I believe he's missed more games than he's played at this point, and when he has played, he's looked awful, let alone the stuff off the field. It's at least you have your players on the defense. Now, good luck with that ownership. In terms of who they've interviewed so far, I've only got one name on the list, and that's Gran Odinsky, who's the offensive coordinator for the Jaguars. We'll see. What's your thoughts on the Browns?
The Browns are in a horrible situation, to put it frankly. I agree that the Raiders are slightly worse in the grand scheme of things, but their quarterback situation is something I would not envy. And I've heard people before, I hear pundits talking about John Harbaugh, Jackson Dart, and the Giants, and why did John Harbaugh choose the Giants? And earlier in the pod, I was going to critique Jackson Dart, but we kind of moved off it. I'm not going to go back to it. But if you're one of these coaches, you want to sign yourself up to a quarterback who's either elite or young and you can grow with and mold into a good player. And unless you think Shedeur Sanders is that for Cleveland, the Browns have the worst quarterback situation I've ever seen. I mean, last season, they had 5 guys, I believe, in the QB room. Shedeur, Watson, Dylan Gabriel, Kenny Pickett at one point, and there was another guy in there. But they had plenty of quarterbacks, none of them good. And if you're a coach looking to take a new job, you're like, let me sign up for the worst situation. Let me tie myself to the franchise that will set me up for the least amount of success, barring the Raiders, which is just kind of, it is what it is. I don't know who takes that job. It's very interesting because I'm not a big Shedeur Sanders guy. I think he actually played slightly better than I thought he would in the NFL, which is a credit to him. However, he did not play very well at all. And every time I watched him, I was like, ooh. So, could he play in the NFL? Could he be a backup? Could he be a bridge starter? I think that is a possibility, genuinely. I think he could improve enough to get into that type of role. But as a starting quarterback, I just do not. I do not see it. And I don't think any amount of coaching is going to get him to the level of franchise starting quarterback. So where does that leave Cleveland in terms of picking their next coach and looking to the future? Well, they have a good defense, which is the rock-solid pillar of their team. And then they have no wide receivers, an aging offensive line, a bad quarterback. And they did have an exciting running back room, but their running back from last year, Quinshon Judkins, who showed a lot of promise, got hurt really pretty gruesomely. So there's some question marks there, and you're looking at a good 2 years before I think Cleveland does anything of significance at all. And you can't blame anything on Kevin Stefanski. I mean, sure, you can lay a little bit at the feet of him, but at the end of the day, he's Cleveland's best coach of the 21st century, bar none. He's the best coach in their franchise's history since the Browns moved to Baltimore and the new Browns started in 1995. I mean, he's their best coach. They made the playoffs twice. They've had 10-plus wins twice, and they even beat the Pittsburgh Steelers in a playoff game, which it was like the Bengals winning a playoff game in 2019. I never thought I'd see the day that they actually did it. And then even with him at the helm, the ownership ultimately has the last say. And I think that's the thing that these coaches are evaluating throughout this process. When you look at Stefanski, he was doing well. He was building the infrastructure. They had the defense. And then Jimmy Haslam came in and made a power move and went over his head. And I'm sure Kevin agreed with it because, he was Deshaun Watson at the time. But he really couldn't, I feel like, talk the owner out of this. I think that was an ownership decision made in conjunction with the GM. And now they're paying the price for it. Watson's hurt. He's bad. He's washed. And he is poisonous to the media and fans writ large. So if you take this job, you have to be comfortable with your boss going over your head and not valuing your opinion. You are simply, to put it lightly, you are a Brian Schottenheimer. You're a Mike McCarthy. That's what happens in Dallas. Jerry makes the moves and the coach, coaches on the field. And you got to be comfortable with that because it's out of your hands. Now, they may give you a little bit longer of a leash because of that situation. The GM may, especially if you're decent. And I think Cleveland fans, they started to want to change before last season, but they understood that Kevin is a good coach and we need to continue to have Kevin in the room in order to keep some level of competency with this franchise. And I think ultimately they decided to rip the Band-Aid off and move off of him. It was healthy, especially for him. I genuinely think Atlanta is going to revive him. I do think at this point in time, if they have a good draft, I'm really liking Atlanta to be a rebound team next year and win their division. But Cleveland, on the other hand, is not something I'd want to sign up for. Your boss will go over your head and just make these decisions, and I don't know what coaches are up for that. It's got to be one of the least desirable jobs besides the Raiders. And like I was saying earlier, a couple of years before they're even relevant. Weird division, Ravens, who knows who they're going to hire, still have really good team infrastructure, and they have a good owner there. Cincinnati could rebound. They need they need a good free agency and a good draft. So you have two semi-competitive teams there, and then Pittsburgh, you could probably throw on that list too. Who knows who they're going to hire? Probably a defensive coordinator of some sort. And then you have the dumpster fire. I don't know. I don't want to sign up for that. I don't know who would. I'd like to hear your take on it.
It makes me think that just because, when I was doing the research, I only had the one name pulled up, and that's the offensive coordinator for the Jags, is that they're potentially looking somebody on staff that is still in the playoff run, still playing in the playoff discussion here. Who do they hire? I don't know. In terms of, once again, if you wanted to pick hierarchy of what teams, what roles to fill in, Browns are definitely at the bottom. And I 100%, you have an organization where, let's just say, even this past draft, let's skip the Watson thing. Do you think when's the last time that you've seen a franchise draft two quarterbacks like that in the same draft? And I'm not talking about here's my first round, and then 3 rounds later, it's like, here's the Kirk Cousins situation and RG3 situation. I'm talking about you drafted a guy, you waited, you drafted a guy in the 3rd round, and then 2 rounds later, you take Shedeur Sanders. And I cannot speak of, and I am not the person that's rooting against Shador Sanders. I want him to do well. I think it'd be a really cool story. Um, but in terms of like some of the analytics I've seen, is that I think he's had the worst in terms of the minimum amount of throws to make the stat possible. I think he had the lowest QBR in the entire league. Doesn't surprise me. If you watched him play, it was, let's just say they heavily relied on their running backs. Um, it just wasn't pretty. It's one of those where they're in cap hell at least I believe for another year until they can get rid of Watson and it be it would feel like digestible to get rid of his contract because I still think even if they cut him now, I don't know, I don't want to say the exact number, but it's still like, oh, here's a 60 million dead cap, and I'm like, nobody's going to pay that. I know these owners are super super rich, but nobody's going to pay that. I wouldn't expect them to pay that. Um, it's just I don't see this. This isn't a situation that we're going to see a fantastic hire out of. Like, wow, that was a really great hire. It's going to be like, good luck, man. Hopefully you can figure out this enigma, this puzzle that you got going on. Is this get a coach and basically sacrifice him in 2 to 3 years for whatever the next hot pool? Probably. I don't want to be that pessimistic, but show me otherwise with a franchise that repeats itself historically very, very often. Not to get off track, but I realized when we were talking about the Ravens, we only talked about Harbaugh. We never talked about potential hires. This one, I think, is a very limited list. We don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it. The only person that they've interviewed is Clint Kubiak, the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks. I think that would be a fantastic hire. I think that's probably going to happen. They probably just haven't closed the deal because the Seahawks are still in it. If you want to put any thoughts on that, or if you want to talk about Clint Kubiak, we can. If not, we can jump over to the next team.
Only thing I have to add is I don't really think their coaching search this offseason was that interesting. I think the Ravens will continue to be a pretty solid team going forward because of Lamar Jackson. This one for me was never really that enticing. And to me, also, I'm kind of bored of the Ravens. I don't dislike the Ravens or anything. I'm just so, bored of them. It will be nice to see them have new leadership, even though I think we're going to get a little more of the same going forward, no matter who they hire.
Yeah, I mean, it sucks. I agree with you. I think the reason why the Ravens can be said is boring is because it's been the same story every year the past few years. I do want to see, because I do like Clint Kubiak. He's related to the Kubiak that we all know growing up, who was head coach for the Texans. Gary Kubiak, who's had some phenomenal success as a head coach and offensive coordinator.
Also won the Super Bowl in 2015 with Denver.
Yes. He's been a very hot name, very hot commodity. I think that could be a really good hire, and I think bringing in an offensive mind is what you need for this team, because how many past, let's say, 2 years, the amount of weapons that they have on offense, and it just poor timing with injuries, it seems like some of the timing's off on the offense. I think the one question that every Ravens fans has had this year is like, here's Derrick Henry with 100 yards rushing in the first half, looks phenomenal, and then the second half he has 3 touches, and it's like, what are we doing? Who is I know they're pulling their hair out. I know one of our friends is on the verge of punching holes in his wall because his team drives him insane because they don't make sense and nobody can make sense of it. I think that's another thing why John Harbaugh was gone. We have 3 teams left on this carousel here. I'll dive into this one because this is my team. This is the Tennessee Titans, who fired Brian Callahan after basically a year and a half into the job with a 4-19 record. Does it surprise me? No. Did I like the Brian Callahan hire when it first happened? No. because I don't believe we should be hiring from a Zach Taylor coaching tree. I'll keep that short, but I was very disappointed and did not expect much. In terms of, you know what, I'm going to stay on Brian Callahan here because I have never had such an underwhelming hire, and the Titans have had a very, let's say in the past 20 years, they have not had very inspiring coaches. The most exciting one I can say is Mike Vrabel. That is the only one that actually made me feel something. I have questioned our decisions as an organization on multiple hirings that they've had at head coach, and Brian Callahan is definitely amongst that list. I've never seen, and I knew the moment was that he was gone this year for sure when he had one of his press conferences after a game and the reporters are going after him justifiably and he's tossing players under the bus. And I'm like, yep, he's gone. He's done. I've not seen anything innovative. I've not seen him, this offensive mind, produce anything, exciting or fun. I guess you could say like, people make fun of me or will point out the Will Levis, circus last year and be like, oh, he's had some moments with Brian Callahan. I'm like, dude, don't remind me of that roller coaster. The amount of memes that we got every week with that man. And then you bring in Cam Ward, and who I'm very excited for going forward, but the adaptations that were made to that offense for Cam Ward were pitiful under his control. They did a much better job towards the end of the season with Mike McCoy, who took over, who's the passing game coordinator. And I could say Tennessee's fault too. It's like, oh, here's Calvin Ridley as your best weapon too. It's disappointing. But I'm done talking about Brian Callahan. He doesn't deserve this amount of time. I hope he goes back to the Bengals, and I hope he makes that organization worse as well. In terms of who they're talking to, our current GM is from the Chiefs organization. So these names don't surprise me. Offensive coordinator, Matt Nagy with the Chiefs. Defensive coordinator with the Chiefs, Steve Spagnuolo. They're talking to Mike McCarthy. They're talking to Lou Anarumo. They're talking to Vance Joseph. Where do I begin? If we sign Matt Nagy to be the head coach, let's just say the safest way I can put this is I'm going to call off work that day and just lay in bed and cry. I was going to say something way worse. I'm not going to do that. That's how Matt Nagy makes me feel because I think of the Bears timeline with him, and I'm pretty sure the Bears fans would have done the same exact thing, or were doing the same exact thing. The highlight of his coaching run is the double doink, and that's the best it's ever going to get. I don't mind Steve Spagnuolo. I like him as a defensive coordinator. I think that's the most likely hire out of this bunch. Mike McCarthy, not inspiring, but has had quite some time. He showed some innovation after being away from the Packers and going to the Cowboys, and I think he could bring some really good coordinators with him as well. I'm not against it. Lou Anarumo, I liked him when he was with the Bengals. I like him when he's your defensive coordinator, I believe, right now. I would be happy with that name. Vance Joseph, he's a good coordinator, but he's already had his run as a head coaching gig. Wasn't super inspiring with that timeline. And then my least favorite one, and I did not mention it because I personally like to think it's fake, but Garrett, former head coach for the Cowboys, the Clapper, I would also be devastated if they hired him. Now, where do I want them to go? I would like for them to go an offensive mindset here, but at this list that I'm looking at, I'm not very inspired by the offensive mindsets. Most exciting one I have is Mike McCarthy, and I'm like, it's good. I mean, I don't think he's bad. He's won a Super Bowl. I can say that. He's had some really good runs with the Cowboys. Time management might be a problem, but I would say out of this entire list, I would be happy with Lou Anarumo or Steve Spagnuolo because I've seen their defenses overperform and I've seen them be monsters as well. And I think, okay, we do have some pieces on the defense, on the defensive line. We definitely need some help at linebackers. Our DBs aren't bad. And it's one of those, if you hire a really good D coordinator, for the love of God, get a offensive genius as an OC. Give him whatever money he wants. Let the head coach just deal with the defense. Please just split the duties. I'm sure you will enjoy this topic as a division rival. What are your thoughts on the Titans?
So what I've been hearing from my sources is that Brian Callahan is actually kind of circulating back in the mix. So I've heard that Tennessee is looking potentially to rehire Brian Callahan after
I would light
him.
myself on fire.
After firing
on chat
him last
for
year.
all of us. I would do it if it happened.
And then they're getting Pete Carroll to oversee him. So we have Brian Callahan and Pete Carroll. That's kind of what I'm hearing for Tennessee. And, Bud Adams isn't rolling over in his grave. He's very happy about this. And I'll tell you who's not rolling over in his grave either is Jim Irsay. But anyway, no, I mean, I don't know what direction Tennessee goes in. I kind of agree with the offensive oriented approach. I think if you draft a young quarterback who's dynamic like Cam Ward, and not dynamic in the sense of running around, I think he's a dynamic athlete within the pocket, which you don't see a lot of. I think they need to mold that into what it, I think they need to grasp that potential and mold that. That's the bread and butter of their team going forward. They're going to open a new stadium. I think they need to move off the run heavy, kind of Patriots light identity that they've used for so long. The interesting thing about the Titans over the past couple of years is that for a while under Vrabel, they were just viewed as Patriots South. They were just a light version of the Patriots. They actually did beat, I believe, New England in one of the playoff games, and Logan Ryan, of all people, intercepted Tom Brady to kind of end his Patriots career. I can't remember what year that was. Was it like 2019? Anyway, they were viewed as Patriots light, would sign a lot of players from the former Belichick regime in New England, and that was their identity. And ultimately, it did prove to be relatively successful. They won a few division titles. They made the playoffs. They were never able to really find sustained success in that era, but the floor was raised pretty high. Eventually, the bottom fell out of that, and they hired Brian Callahan, who gave them no identity. There was no identity in Tennessee this past couple of years. They were just the island of misfit toys, never really had any good receivers. They didn't have Derrick Henry anymore. They were rolling out scrub quarterbacks. Now they have Cam Ward. They're starting to rebuild that. They didn't want Brian Callahan to poison the development of Cam Ward, and rightfully so. And they need somebody who's going to be able to mold him. That's just, if I was going to say anything about the coaching search, that's kind of where I'd land at. And the other two things I'd like to add on the Titans coaching search is, one, their receivers are horrible. They have to go find more receiving talent in the draft. I haven't started any draft prep. I haven't really looked at who the top receivers are this year or even looked at the free agents coming out, but they have to do something more than Calvin Ridley and a bunch of randos out there. I think Cam Ward needs somebody to throw to. The second thing about the Titans is just the overall level of talent on their roster, and I'll summarize it by using really the only relevant Tennessee Titans related quote out of the season, which is from their quarterback Cam Ward, who said, "I'm not going to lie to y'all, we ass." I may be butchering that, but I think that's relatively what he said, and he's right. They are ass, and they need more talent. So really, you can only go up from here. I just hope they find someone who is able to develop alongside Cam Ward offensively.
Yeah, and I will say Cam Ward has, in my mind, he has shown enough for me to be like, okay, I think this can be our guy, because I think prescribed it accurately, is that he is a difference maker in the pocket with how he navigates, him getting out of pressure. He has those moments where he looks like he has the sixth sense, and he has the arm power and the way that he angles, his elbows, his shoulders on certain throws. I'm like, ooh, that's it's very exciting to see. Like, all right, he just threw the ball 30 yards down the field on a dot, sidearm, running out of the pocket. I'm like, this is exciting. This is the best arm talent I've seen with the Titans probably in my lifetime in terms of like what he can do right there. Obviously, still young, still making mistakes. This is a team that has spent a lot of draft capital and money on the offensive line for it to be average at best, which is frustrating. The receiving core is legitimately awful. I agree that we're in the position with the fourth spot, with the fourth pick, to get the wide receiver of our choice. Whether that's the guy out of Arizona State, whether that's the guy from USC, Ohio State guy, we'll see. We'll see. We have our pick. I am excited to see where they go with it. I think that's the most needed position as well, if not defensive line. It's even though it was a horrible season, I am excited to see what the future holds with Cam Ward, and I'm trying to be optimistic about who they hire going forward. Off of my team and my train of misery, let's jump onto another franchise's misery train, and that is the Miami Dolphins, who have fired Mike McDaniels, who had a 35-35 record. Very exciting time for a couple seasons in Miami. One of the highest scoring offenses one year. I remember that year where they rolled the Denver Broncos. I believe they put up 70 points. And they just looked electric. This is the best that Tua's looked. Tyreek Hill in his prime. They had serviceable defenses, a couple names on there. And then it just kind of sputtered out at the end. We were watching, and this is unfortunate for McDaniels because I do like him. I think he's a very special coach. I think the fact that he got fired, and then within like 3 days of getting fired, you got the Lions calling him up. You got all these different teams like, hey, be our offensive coordinator, please, please, please. So I think that's basically a signal that this is the Dolphins the team itself was slowly and having constant injuries on defense, and pieces were falling off year after year. Their offensive line was falling off, and then you're just watching Tua's play decline, where he was like, okay, he's got some of an arm, he's known for his accuracy, and then it gets to the point this year where it's like he gets benched. They're putting in Quinn Ewers, and the game that Quinn Ewers started, I'm like, he don't look that bad. I think it's not a bad decision to have him over Tua at the moment. It's just, it was a situation where I think there was a lot of excitement when it first started. They were making runs they made the playoffs a couple times. They were making runs. They were being competitive in that division. And it just, I think the culture and a lot of the players just, this was a roster that was just slowly falling apart, and it was all based on really Tua right there. Because how many times did he have missed games? How many times have we seen him throw out gang signs or be concussed or do the stupidest shit ever? Where it's like, all right, as a 5'10", maybe 220-pound quarterback, I'm going to lower my head directly into my defender's chest and hope for the best. I'm like, dude's a genius. Dude is a genius. So I think McDaniel got dealt a bad piece of cards because he had the talent when he first showed up. It just got worse every single year it went in. And anytime they were going on a run, they lost a key piece along the way. That being said, with him being fired, some of the names that I've read come up. Of course, Kevin Stefanski, not on the list anymore. Robert Saleh, Anthony Campanelle, who's the defensive coordinator for the Jags, Patrick Graham, who's the Raiders DC, which I was kind of like, it's interesting, but I guess he's had a long tenure in the NFL with a lot of different organizations, well respected. And those are the names that I've heard so far. I don't know if you've heard any differently or if you wanted to add on to the Mike McDaniel, who is definitely one of the most interesting coaches and press conferences, probably of all time, to be honest.
Mike McDaniel is going to be one of the most sought-after offensive coordinator hires in a long, long, long time. I think he's going to get a really good role at coming into next season. I think probably in a coordinator spot, but you can't be so sure because there are quite a few jobs open. I think Mike McDaniel was cursed by having Tua at quarterback. That capped the amount of success Miami could have because they did have weapons like Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Devon Achane. You hear those names, you think offensive explosion. And if you had a quarterback like Joe Burrow or Justin Herbert, who they could have potentially drafted in 2020, you maybe not Joe Burrow because the Bengals had the first pick, but regardless, you just think, wow, this team is going to be a success, and whoever their coach was probably a success. He was to a certain extent. He did have on-field success. He actually Mike McDaniel impressed me because I thought the Dolphins were going to bottom out and be horrible, like absolute horrible team this year. And instead, they kind of grinded into the edge of the playoff race there toward the end of the season, kind of pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. And I think you got to give the Dolphins and Mike McDaniel credit for that. One of the other issues, I think, when it comes to Mike McDaniel and the Dolphins specifically, is his demeanor. Of course, he had that kind of like bro-y, nerdy vibe, and that's cool when you're winning and it's new and it's fresh. But when you're coaching a bunch of like high-powered kind of alpha tough guys in an NFL locker room and you start to experience some turbulence, I think guys could be quicker to turn on you maybe if they don't respect you as much as like a leader or somebody who's willing to set the tone and set the floor. And I think Mike McDaniel relied on his players to set the tone, but he didn't really have too many of those guys. And I think he maybe kind of leaned on Tua, who he himself was probably out on as a player, not as a person, but he kind of at the end there, I think, was like, okay, I really like Tua, but I've maximized my returns on Tua. I can't really go any farther with this. Tua couldn't set the tone in the locker room. The Dolphins have had a weird dynamic. So going forward, they did try the young hotshot coach, and it worked to varying degrees of success. Now, I don't know where they go. I think they're probably hungry for someone who is more of a tone setter. I could see a Robert Saleh being an option for Miami. But the biggest question to me is not really at coach, but rather at quarterback. And I don't really know what they're going to do. It's kind of paired together. I wouldn't rank one over the other, I guess. But maybe a defensive kind of guy who could set the tone is just what Miami needs. But I don't know. This one, I think it's pretty clear what went wrong in Miami. I think everybody's kind of understands that, you know, McDaniel couldn't really control the locker room after they started to lose, and that Tua really just isn't the guy. And until they have a guy, I don't think it really matters who the coach is because it's going to make the job less valuable. It's not the Miami sports thing, man. It's so weird. You would think Miami would be able to get whoever they want in any sport, baseball, basketball, football. They did do that in basketball. You would think in football this would just be everybody goes to Miami and the Dolphins are having a great old time like it was the 1970s and they win all the time, and that's just not the case.
Yeah, I will say I do think this is Mike McDaniel getting fired is probably the best thing for his career. I'm not going to lie. Watch, he's going to whatever team he signs with, he's going to ball out with them for 2 years, 3 years. He's going to get another head coaching gig. He's talked about coaches getting a revival, a second shot. And you're right, just Miami kind of bottom out. They put all the eggs in the Tua basket. And not just play-wise, but also money-wise, they're stuck with Tua for a few years with the contract that they gave him. So, and then, Tyreek Hill gets injured, out for the season this year. He wanted out of Miami. I could definitely see him being cut. I think A-Chain still stays there. I think Waddle, I think he does stay there, but he's often injured at the worst times of the year as well, every year. This is just a team that had some pieces, lost them, and I think it would be. I agree. I think Robert Saleh in this scenario makes a lot of sense, where it's like, hey, we are officially capped on the offensive side. Let's build up this defense as we should, as much as we can. It's just, yeah, it's disappointing because the Miami Dolphins have had so many years, let's say in the past 25, 30 years, just they've had talent, but they've never been able to put it together, and it's no difference in this era of the Dolphins. And you would think that a team that, let's say, is in a state that has no income tax and beautiful weather most of the year, and they have some minor, but they are advantages that other teams don't have, and they just can't put it all together at one time. We'll see who they hire, but I still think it is a long road back to being competitive in the division, especially with the resurgence of the Patriots. With the Bills, will always be a threat as long as Josh Allen is on that team. And then I guess you don't ever have to worry about the Jets, so that's a positive. You can finish third forever. It's better than fourth. Moving on from the Dolphins here, though, the last team that we had to cover is one of the franchises that we talked about, the most disappointing franchises of all time, or the worst franchise. That was my nomination with the Arizona Cardinals, who had fired Jonathan Gannon, who went 15-36 in his time there. And for a heavily noted defensive mind coming out of Philadelphia, the defense for the Cardinals just never really got set under his regime. They had some players, Buda Baker, they did bring back, defense has been disappointing. They've had some skilled players there. The offense, the Kyle Murray experiment is over. To be quite frank, ever since his ACL tear, he hasn't looked quite exactly the same. He's lacked some of the explosiveness. He's still a running threat, but he's definitely not as much of a dual threat. He's had to rely more on his passing, and that's just not his specialty. It's just not. I remember how many times that they'd get down in the red zone, and then Arizona's offense would shut off. And then I think most people would agree, as soon as Jacoby Brissett stepped in this year, that offense got hands down better, just in terms of how they move the ball. Now they're still getting their ass kicked almost every week, and that was because of the defensive side of the ball there. They just could not stop anything. And I think what also hurt Jonathan Gannon there was that the coordinators that he had in power, who were definitely underwhelming, he kept him in power for too long. He was slow to make change. I still remember the awkward, basically, video that was released when he got first with the team and he met with Kyle Murray, and it was the most awkward interaction I've ever seen in my life between a head coach and a quarterback. It's just, it's almost one of those that, let's just say in 5 years from now, it's going to be like, oh yeah, Jonathan Gannon was the head coach of the Cardinals, because nothing remarkable happened. Nothing crazy happened with this team. In their defense, they have been in one of the toughest divisions in terms of even stretches of NFL history with the NFC West. It's been brutal for them, between the Rams, between the 49ers, and then even Seattle. I mean, let's say in the past 10 years, how many times has a team from this division been a representative in the Super Bowl? A lot, a good amount. San Fran multiple years, the Rams potentially twice, depending on how this season goes. It's I have pity for them, but this is an organization that has been stuck as a bottom dweller for a long time, and I don't see that changing. I hate to be pessimistic on that, but here's their list of people they talked to so far. Vance Joseph, Anthony Weaver, new name on the list. He's the Patriots passing game coordinator. Clint Kubiak, Robert Saleh, Mike LaFleur, who is associated with the Rams, their offensive coordinator. Who do they hire? Your guess is as good as mine, man. I've not heard anyone leaning one way. I think this is a relatively unappealing job. This is also kind of bottom tier. You don't have a promising young quarterback. You don't have, some defensive pieces in set. This isn't as bad as the Raiders or the Browns, but I would definitely say this is also not a top tier job destination. Just a unremarkable coaching tenure and timeline for the Cardinals once again.
I was always a little suspect of it from the start, specifically because Kyler Murray, he did not work out at quarterback. He was never really in it. It seemed like his heart was never in it. I don't know what team he's going to go to in the offseason, but it seemed like Gannon started to pick it up a little bit when he had Jacoby Brissett at quarterback, who is a famous journeyman. He was pretty good in fantasy for a while, but I don't know where they go from here. Like you said, your guess is as good as mine. I have no feel for this situation whatsoever. It feels better than the Raiders or the Browns, I think, but I'm not super confident in that. And I don't see them being competitive for a while because their division is just so stacked. I can't really see them getting ahead. I think they do have some pieces there, but I don't really know what way the winds are blowing in Arizona. This is the one I have the least feel for. Maybe I said that early in the pod for another team. If I did, I rescind that. This is the situation I have the least feel for. I honestly don't know. I'm not a big Kyler Murray guy. I do think Jonathan Gannon is funny because he looks like Kendall Roy from Succession. Grant, my little brother, pointed that out, which I always got a crack out of. But yeah, your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, it's no matter what this franchise does, it's unexciting. I hate to be pessimistic like that, but I have never met a Cardinals fan in my life. And I'm sure the Cardinals fans that do exist, all three of them, would also agree that this has been a very long pain train, and the fact that what they have to look back on in terms of, is Kurt Warner and Carson Palmer, and those are their hero and idols at basically in-tenured guys at the last run of their career. So we'll see who they hire. You never know. It's one of those where I think the Cardinals, because of their so low expectations, is that, and this is like that kind of in the Raiders situation where hey, everybody else in your division is doing phenomenal right now. This is your time to kind of be in the shadow, be in the depths, and just build this team right. It's going to take a handful of years to do it. You're not going to be good next year. You're not going to be good the year after that. You might be competitive the year. I would say you got a 3 to 5 year plan here. Whereas some of these other teams, it's all right, let's do a 1 to 3. You have a 3 to 5. And that's what I would say is the Browns, the Raiders, the Cardinals. In order for you to be truly competitive, you might have to wait 5 years for that at this point. That sounds awful, but that's the timeline I'm looking at. Now, this episode is not going to take 3 to 5 years to get out. But we wanted to cover the coach carousel for you guys. We had some fantastic games on last night. We have 2 games going on today. The 3 o'clock game is the Patriots and Texans. we're not going to do a deep dive into the game here, but my pick is for the Patriots, especially with the news that their number one offensive threat for the Texans, Nico Collins, has been ruled out for this game. That's devastating. And then the later game is the Rams and the Bears, which should be a very exciting game because you're already in Toronto. You know how bad the weather is up there. I'd imagine Chicago's not too far off. I think that spells more negative for the Rams than it does the Bears. And, of course, the Rams make more sense to me, but I'm just going to keep jumping on the Bears and their magic run. Caleb Williams is special, and I think he will pull a rabbit out of his hat again, and I think they will upset the Rams. Now, if this was in L.A., I would pick the Rams, but I think this is truly a home field advantage situation. And then the last thing I want to comment on is how devastated Broncos fans must be, which is weird to say after a win, but then to hear that your quarterback fractures his ankle on the second to last play, and now your backup is going to be leading you, representing you in the AFC Championship game. So I'll leave it off with you there.
Yeah, really quickly, because I'm getting the signal from my producer, is I think the Bo Nix injury is wild. Just total unfortunate luck for Denver here. And I don't really know where they go from this. We're going to get a weird Jarrett Stidham start in the AFC Championship game after Denver has completely revived their franchise. Totally unprecedented. And then the second one, I'm still liking the Rams. I don't know about the Bears' voodoo magic here. And then I'm also going to go with New England. I think New England pulls this out. They looked not great last week, but I thought they looked like a team who was, I don't know. They kind of have this feel about them right now. And with Denver getting the Bo Nix injury, I think the doors open up for New England here. I think they're kind of gunning for this. And then also, really quickly, I would like to officially pick Indiana to win the college football playoff.
I agree. I think Indiana is just this army of 3 stars that have been so well coached. Kurt Cignetti is him. All kudos to Miami. I think this is a defensive unit that did not get talked enough coming in. And I think Indiana as a team was also kind of like, how real of a number 1 seed they are. They have just shown up, and they have done everything right, and they have not taken their foot off of the gas. And this, I'm not trying to make a leap here, but if Indiana were to win, which I think they do, I think you got to have the conversation of they might be one of the best college football teams of all time. You got to put them in the discussion, at least, which is wild for a team, a university that 2 years ago wasn't even a thought bubble in the Big Ten, and now they're running it. So I agree. I'm excited. So that game's on Monday night. We got 2 fantastic games today. I'm excited to cover those topics with you next week and a couple more. We should have a longer episode next week, so we'll be able to dive in a little bit more. But regardless, I'm glad that we got together. We got to record for y'all. I'm sure some of y'all probably like the shorter episodes as well. And maybe we'll do that in the future where if we do a longer episode, maybe I could look into cutting it up some, just into the individual topics. That way it's maybe a little bit more digestible for some people. We'll see. We'll put a feeler out for them. But I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thank you for tuning in. If you haven't, we appreciate a like, a subscribe, a share. We want to continue to grow this thing, and I think we're getting to the point where we're getting a bank built up, and maybe by like episode 10, we start releasing this on our actual social media. We'll see.
Yeah.
That's what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, me too. I think we're gunning up to start putting it out more. I think we just got to continue to get a feel, and then once we feel like this is a good product, we're ready to roll. And we do think this is a good product. So anyway, from Canada, like, subscribe, and we will see you all next week.
Bye, everybody.